Welcome to the McCarthy Report, the podcast where I, Rich Lowry, discuss with Andy McCarthy the latest legal and national security issues. This week, what else? The Danchenko case. You are, of course, listening to a National View podcast. If for some reason you're not already following us on a streaming service, you can find us everywhere from Spotify to iTunes. And please give this podcast and Andy McCarthy the glowing, indeed gushing 5-star reviews they deserve on iTunes. And now, without further ado, I welcome to this very podcast through the miracle of Zoom, none other than Andy McCarthy.
Rich, how are you?
Good, Andy. How are you?
I'm okay. You're my window into baseball. I haven't watched an inning since that terrible
postseason's still going. The asteroids looking asteroids. Sorry, that's what we call them in my household. The Astros looking tough.
Yeah, it was a tough weekend.
Yeah, well, you can lose a 3-game series to anyone.
Yep, we proved that. That's for sure.
Yeah. All
Actually,
right.
they took my heart out in Atlanta, so I didn't have much left for them last weekend anyway. So
it's tough. Well, as you said last week, I guess it's hard to have a sour taste in your mouth after a 101 win season, but you know, you had that after the Atlanta series. You have it even more now.
Yep.
But 101 wins. I mean, what can you do? It was a good year.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of those things where maybe you'll be able to say that a month from now, but it's just too raw right now. So Anyway.
All right. So let's get right to it with the Danchenko case and revelations associated with it. Most importantly and shockingly, that the FBI offered Christopher Steele $1 million if he could corroborate the dossier, which of course he couldn't. So let's start at the beginning. What is Danchenko? Who's Danchenko, and what is he accused of, and how do we get this $1 million revelation?
Well, Danchenko is Steele's principal source for the dossier. What we ought to remember about Steele, I guess, for these purposes, is he's a British or former British spy, MI6. Which is the overseas spy service, kind of akin to our CIA. He ran the Russia desk for MI6 for a number of years, but he himself has not been in Russia since the late 1990s, when I believe his cover was blown. So he doesn't have direct sources in Russia, and he relies on people who do, like Danchenko. So he interestingly, he meets Danchenko through Fiona Hill, when Danchenko is a researcher at the Brookings Institution, and Fiona Hill is working there. This is long before any of them ever had any involvement with Donald Trump or the Trump administration. But it was evidently it was Hill who introduced Steele, her friend Steele, to her friend Danchenko. And I think Danchenko's claim to fame, Rich, is that he did some research in 2006 or thereabouts that indicated that Putin's claim to have a doctorate in economics was, based on nonsense. That it was
who could have imagined it?
Yeah, right. I think he discovered that it was plagiarized, et cetera. So that was his research. But at the same time, there's good reason to believe he was also a Russian asset, and the FBI was actually investigating him as such in 2009. And the basis for that was after Obama won the 2008 election, Brookings is kind of like often the Democratic administration in waiting. So there was a lot of talk about who at Brookings was going to the Obama administration, and Danchenko, the reporting is, approached two people who were believed to be, ticketed to go to the State Department, and said to them something along the lines of if they wanted to share classified information, he could make it worth their while. So that was evidently tipped off to the Bureau. They did some investigating, and they found that Danchenko was connected to at least two people who they knew were Russian spies, Russian assets in the United States. and also had some visits to the Russian consulate in Washington. So they geared up. This is like chapter one of this whole fiasco. The FBI gears up in 2009, 2010 to get a FISA warrant on Danchenko, and they end up deciding not to go forward with the warrant because they believe that Danchenko has left the country. P.S. Danchenko has not left the country. He was pretty much like right under their nose most of the time in Washington. So flash forward to 2016. In the interim, Danchenko has developed this professional relationship with Steele, who runs this private intelligence outfit in London called Orbis, and he works occasionally as a contractor for Steele. And when Steele gets recruited by the Clinton campaign, ultimately, but the cutouts are the law firm, Mark Elias's law firm, and Fusion GPS, which is who brings Steele in to do the dossier, and Steele brings Danchenko in to help him get all the information. So that's the setup for this. Here's the important thing of the timeline, Rich, where we get to the $1 million. The Bureau starts to get Steele's reporting in around June of 2016. And he does these reports from probably like May principally until the election. There's one or two that are after the election, but the important ones obviously are the ones before. And so the Bureau has a lot of his reporting, including the infamous P tape, and more importantly, the stuff about how Trump is involved in what they call a conspiracy of cooperation with Putin, where there's back scratching involved, where Trump is going to take Ukraine off the map as an American political issue to benefit Putin, and Putin is going to use his spy agencies to help Trump win the election by dumping dirt on the Democrats. That's what the dossier, as we all know now, is filled with. So in Rome in 2016, the FBI, a number of FBI people meet with Steele, and the purpose of the meeting is to try to intensify Steele's work for the Bureau. And what they basically say to him is, look, we have all these allegations, and they offer him, they say basically the government will pay you $1 million if you can prove that this is true, if you could get us information that'll corroborate it. I think the importance of that, Rich, it's not unheard of, obviously, for the government to pay for information. That's a fairly common thing. But here, the importance is October 16th is also the month where they go to the FISA court for the first time. So if you tell somebody, I will pay you $1 million if you can corroborate this information, that's tantamount to saying it's not corroborated. And the problem with that is, under federal law and under FISA court rules, they are supposed to verify information before they bring it to the FISA court. Instead, what they do is in October and then again in mid-January, they go to the FISA court to get warrants under oath. Their applications are under oath. It's called a verified application. And they rely on Steele's information after offering him $1 million to corroborate and not having to pay because he can't. And then even worse, they don't get around to interviewing Danchenko until late January of 2017, by which time they've already been to the FISA court twice. And when they interview Danchenko, he tells them Steele's information is complete nonsense. It's all exaggeration, innuendo, et cetera, et cetera. So what do? Do they go back to the FISA court and say, gee, we were wrong, Judge, sorry about that? No, they get 2 more warrants relying on Steele's information, and they add a footnote in connection with the third warrant. This is the first one they get in April of 2017 after they've interviewed Danchenko. And they say, we interviewed Danchenko in an effort to further corroborate Steele, who, of course, has not been corroborated at all. And they tell the court that they found Danchenko to be truthful and cooperative. But what they don't tell him is what he was truthful and cooperative about was that everything in the Steele dossier was nonsense. So if you're a judge reading this, what you say to yourself is, well, they interviewed the source to corroborate the guy who they've been relying on, and they found the source to be truthful and cooperative. They must have corroborated him. So it's really outrageous.
So is the $1 million award? So this isn't like we're giving you $1 million to further your research. It's like a prize, basically, and right. that's not. I mean, just the scale of it, just the whole setup seems highly unusual to me. But this is of a kind. It is not. It's not that different in kind from other such arrangements by the government to get information. So
in the Blind Shake case, we paid Imad Salem, who was our main informant, $1 million. It was at that time, I don't think we had ever paid an informant that much money. But the thing with Salem was, it was after the World Trade Center had been bombed. We had lots of intelligence indicating that they were trying to do an even more spectacular strike. And we were basically asking him to work for us full time, to be an active informant. He actually went into the Blind Shake's house and recorded him giving orders to conduct a bombing attack on an American military installation. Without that evidence, we would not have been able to convict people in the trial. We were able to break up the attack while they were mixing explosives. And then his life was over once that was done, because he's a target now for the rest of his life. So he's got to be relocated. He's got, his whole family is threatened, et cetera. So in order to induce that cooperation, we had to agree that we were going to compensate him for it. And then it was a negotiated settlement at the end. But the thing with it, Rich, is we did it by a written contract, which I helped negotiate. And we disclosed it to the jury. I mean, we told everybody, this is the deal. This is what we paid him. This is why we paid him. This is what we got out of it. This is what he gets out of it. And if people didn't like that, or they thought that $1 million in 1995 was a bigger deal, obviously, than $1 million is today. But I think we were able to say, would you do this for $1 million? And a lot of people wouldn't. In Danchenko's case, they never got to the point where even in, we'll get to the Danchenko payments, by the way, but in Steele's case, I don't think they ever got to the point of drawing up a contract because he couldn't deliver. Mm-hmm. So it never got to that point. But I think the relevance of it for our current purposes is, how do you go under oath to the FISA court when the requirement is that the information be verified, and you've offered a guy $1 million to corroborate information because it's not corroborated? And we're not talking about like a penny ante case. We're talking about a case where they're going into a United States court to tell them that a major party candidate for the president and then the sitting president of the United States is a Russian asset. And they don't even bother to interview the guy's main source until they've gone twice under oath to the FISA court. I mean, I just can't even, if you design this as a movie script, they throw it back at you because they'd say this is too unrealistic. Nobody would believe this could happen.
Yeah, so it's not the prospective payment that's outrageous necessarily. It's that it shows that they were vouching for information that they knew wasn't verified.
Well, let me ask you. Let's say Trump had been a Russian asset, and Steele was able to establish that. Like, let's say he had come back and said, and brought tapes and said, "Here's meetings with Trump or Trump's people talking to Russian," where he was able to establish it. That'd have been worth, if that were true, that would have been worth a lot more than $1 million, right?
Yeah,
so
that would be worth a lot.
Yeah. So I think the thing is, it's okay to engage in these things if it's fair consideration for something that really is of great importance. But where it's relevant to us is because of what it says about what their state of information was at the time that they went to a U.S. court under oath and made outrageous allegations, which, to my mind, they continued to cover up for years afterwards.
So in this case, there are a couple FBI agents who are very relevant. Let's go into them a little bit.
Yeah. So Brian Auten, and I should start this, Rich, by saying that here's a big difference between the Sussman case and the Durham case. And the more I think about this, the more I think it's important. And that is that in the Sussman case, which we talked about so much a few months ago, Durham was supervising things from the sidelines. In the Danchenko case, he is trying the case, and he is not just like a spare part. He has taken on the most difficult witnesses in the case. And the reason I think that it's important to note that is this is a very hard case for the government to win. It's a very tough case. I mean, I give them maybe a 2 chance in 10 to get guilty verdicts on some of the counts. But I think you can be an agent of sunlight or an agent of cover-up. And what went wrong in the Sussman trial is it looked like what the prosecution was trying to do was conceal the FBI's misconduct and shine the light only on Sussman. And I think they got blown up by that. And in this case, where Durham is very hands-on and trying the case himself, I think he's doing this the only way you can do it and win the case, which is to say to the jury, we're not here to defend the FBI. We're going to uncover what the FBI did here. You're not going to like what the FBI did. We don't like what the FBI did, but it doesn't mean that Danchenko didn't commit the crimes he's charged with. We had to do something like that in the Blind Shake case as well, where the FBI made a lot of mistakes and some worse things in the investigation. But the thing is, in my case, Rich, if the jury walks the guys, they're walking terrorists. In this case, the jury's being asked to convict somebody of, telling comparatively trivial lies to the FBI under circumstances where the FBI itself misled a court under oath. I think it's a tougher case for Durham in that way, but I do think the only way he can win it is by being transparent like that. And I take my hat off to him because I think that's the way he's approached it so far. And that's evident with the 2 agents that you've just asked me about. The first one is Brian Auten, who is a supervisory intelligence analyst with the Bureau. He's the one who basically led the questioning of Danchenko when they interviewed him finally in January of 2017. He writes a memo a couple of weeks later, which essentially lays out where Danchenko says that Steele is just wrong or exaggerating or making stuff up or whatever. And the problem is the FBI does not share the memo with the Justice Department division that handles FISA applications to the FISA court, much less do they disclose this to the FISA court. So Auten is in the middle of the team that continues to rely on Steele's information. And what he mainly did in jousting with Durham, when Durham put him on the stand, and then it was more like he was cross-examining them than examining them. But what he mainly did was try to distance himself from the FISA application, saying, no, that wasn't me. That wasn't my job. I talked to the witness. What they did with the information, who knows, right? So he's trying to stay a million miles away from it, but it's through his testimony that we learn that the Bureau offered, Auten says that the Bureau offered Steele, $1 million to corroborate his information. And Auten admits that the FBI never corroborated Steele's information. Steele wasn't able to do it. Danchenko wasn't able to do it. Other intelligence agencies weren't able to do it. A lot of effort was made to do it, but they couldn't do it because there was nothing to those allegations. So that's been the relevance of Lawton's testimony. Now, here's something that, if your blood isn't already curdling over some of the stuff we've already discussed about the Bureau, here's some more to just make your head explode. After the Inspector General of the Justice Department, Mike Horowitz, does his big investigation of how the Bureau handled this crossfire hurricane Trump-Russia investigation, Chris Wray, the director of the FBI, refers Lawton to the Office of Professional Responsibility at the Bureau for internal discipline. In other words, they're to do an investigation on him and then propose what ought to be done, whether it's a suspension, whether he's to be fired, whatever. So he's under that investigation. Apparently they've recommended, the testimony came out this week, they've recommended a suspension. He's appealing that. So, okay, fine. So you would think that while he's under the cloud of that, they wouldn't let him do anything important, particularly because if he does anything too important and he ends up in court, they have to disclose all this, which is the last thing you would want to do in a trial, right? So what did they do? Well, when Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson start to collect information about Hunter Biden, most of which does not have anything to do with the Hunter laptop. This is all like financial information that shows that there's millions of dollars going into the Biden family coffers through Hunter's work. So the Democrats on the Intelligence Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee asked the FBI to look into what Grassley and Johnson are collecting. And they turned to this guy, Thibault, who is the supervising agent in the Washington field office. And now we know notoriously, he's a guy who's on his social media account. He's got all kinds of anti-Trump stuff and anti-Republican stuff. So evidently they know exactly who they're turning to look into what Johnson and Grassley have collected. And Thibault brings in his pal Lawton to do an intelligence assessment of what Grassley and Johnson have collected. Lawton dutifully writes a report from which the Bureau, which is basically Thibault in this instance, concludes that the information is probably Russian disinformation. And that becomes the kernel from which everybody then runs with this political narrative that all this derogatory Hunter Biden information, which, by the way, doesn't have a scintilla of connection to Russian intelligence, and there's no evidence that it's Russian disinformation, that becomes the political narrative in the last month of the campaign, that we can't talk about the Hunter stuff because it's Russian disinformation. So we have Lawton getting himself involved in the 2016 presidential election and the 2020 presidential election. It's unbelievable.
And then how does Danchenko come to get payments or offers of payments?
This is remarkable, too. So after they interviewed Danchenko beginning in January of 2017, rather than go to the FISA court and disclose that this whole thing is a farce, enter another agent whose name is Kevin Helson, who becomes assigned to the FBI to handle Danchenko. And he convinces himself that Danchenko is just a peachy asset on Russia's efforts to destabilize the United States. So he basically downplays the dossier and Danchenko's obvious role. Now, let's not, we can blame Steele for exaggerating and presenting all this stuff as if it was hard intelligence. But let's not forget the information, the nonsense that he's putting in there, he did get from Danchenko, like about 80% of it. And they were never able to prove any of it. And we now know, based on what Durham has investigated, that if they had done just a little bit of investigation of Danchenko, they would have realized that he was holding back on some sources and he was making up other stuff. But instead, they bring this guy in, Helson, and he recommends that the FBI sign up Danchenko as a paid informant. Now, there's at least two ways of looking at this. One is you sign him up as a paid foreign counterintelligence informant. And what does that mean? He's now, whenever they say methods and sources, we can't tell you that it'll compromise methods and sources. He now becomes sources in that methods and sources chorus they do. And what that means, Rich, now we don't have enough information about this yet, but they could have done this to make it more difficult for people like Horowitz to interview Danchenko in connection with the FISA abuse and the other downsides of the investigation. And in fact, Horowitz's report is very lengthy. There's a lot of information about it about Danchenko, but there's no indication in that report that he interviewed Danchenko. So it could be that they were trying to keep this guy buried because they knew they were sitting on a really embarrassing powder keg. But the other thing is, you can never say with these guys that they may not have convinced themselves that if he was saying things they wanted to hear, that he was valuable. So this guy Helson convinces the Bureau to sign him up, and they keep him as an informant from around, I want to say March of 2017 until finally October of 2020. He is decommissioned when Barr, who was then the Attorney General, Bill Barr, reveals that in 2017, he had told them that the Steele reporting was nonsense. And at that point, the Bureau decided to decommission him. But before they did, after they had paid him $200,000 for the information that he gave them from in that 3-year period, this guy Helson recommends that they pay him a lump sum of $346,000 more dollars. Happily, they say no on that. They finally say no. But
I went into the wrong line of work. I should have been a sketchy FBI informant.
You can't even make it up. What Helson sets the guy up, he writes, they have a standard form that you have to fill out when you sign the guy up. So one of the things they say is, are you aware of any derogatory information about the guy that you want us to pay as an informant? He says no. It turns out that he didn't find out that in 2009, the FBI had a counterintelligence investigation on Danchenko on suspicion that he was a Russian spy. So he says, no, we don't have any. I checked our systems. We don't have any derogatory information. And it turned out he missed that one. So the other thing is the FBI has a unit that does evaluation of human sources before they get to sign them up. And they have a woman who works in the unit who was in the U.S. Army in Europe for 19 years as a counterintelligence person in the military. She looks at Danchenko and she says, I think this guy is GRU. I think he's a Russian asset. And Helson said, there's no evidence that that's true. Of course, he doesn't know anything. He didn't do like basic due diligence on the guy. So they say to him, well, here's what we want you to do. Look into his travel history. Look and see if there's any like visa or immigration fraud involved. Polygraph him to see what his motives are. Find out if he's ever done any tasking for a foreign government. They give him all these things to do. He doesn't do any of them. And yet they approve Danchenko as an asset anyway. And he goes to work for the FBI. And according to this guy Helson now, he testified that by losing Danchenko as an informant, when Barr revealed that information, the national security of the United States was really damaged. And he helped us with 25 different investigations of Russian misbehavior and worse in the United States. Of course, he wasn't able to point to a single case that came out of any of this stuff. And apparently, one of the complaints from the people who evaluate information from confidential sources is that at least 50% of what Danchenko was reporting was what they call open source information, which means like he listens to the McCarthy report and then he goes to, so they were complaining that he's given us a lot of information that you can get through the media. And what Helson says about that is, well, of course, there has to be some context for the stuff that he's telling us that's confidential. The bottom line is, every time, if you go back 20 years, every time you look at some incident that causes us to peer behind the classified protection of all this and see how they're actually doing their job, there are problems. And even after the Trump-Russia investigation, the FISA court insisted that they go back and look at all the FISA warrants that they've sought for a number of years. And it turned out it was rife with problems across the board. It wasn't just the Trump-Russia abuses. There were systematic problems. So I just really think that serious consideration has to be given to removing their foreign counterintelligence mission. I don't want to say in a blanket way that they're not good at it, that they never get it right, because that would be an overstatement, but they get it wrong too many times for it to be credible. And because being a spy agency is such a different discipline than being a law enforcement agency, you have to worry that the practice of foreign counterintelligence and the practice of spying, which prioritizes secrecy over fidelity to the Constitution, is undermining the Bureau as a law enforcement agency, and we mainly need it as a law enforcement agency.
So, Andy, let's move on and go to the January 6th committee. We're recording, of course, as is our want, late morning, early afternoon, Friday yesterday. It had its final hearing, I guess, before the election. At least I've kind of tuned out January 6th committee news. The aggregation site I look at all the time, called Memorandum, always the January 6th stuff is at the top of it, and I just don't pay much attention to it. So I wasn't really aware of this hearing upcoming until it showed up on my cable news. It was on Fox, and just so much of it was a total regurgitation of things we've heard now a million times, snippets of testimony we've heard before, video we've seen before. But I guess it's fair enough if it's a summation, at least for now. The new things were, one, we had video of Nancy Pelosi, which I found pretty compelling just as a news junkie. I'm not sure many ordinary voters find it particularly interesting, but with her huddling with Schumer and others at times during that day, talking to Mike Pence, talking to the former Democratic governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, about how they get help, how they clear out the Capitol, how they can reconvene. And, she repeatedly says that Trump is responsible for this. So they had that, which was new. And then they have the dramatic subpoena they're issuing for Donald Trump. So what did you make of it?
I made of it, Rich, that they couldn't figure out how to end it. And they're having some internal squabbling about that. I think Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who, Liz lost, obviously, her primary. Kinzinger didn't even try to get reelected because that was a lost cause. So, they're almost at the end of their time in the House, and they don't have anything to do but do, January 6th committee hearings. This is, this is their time to shine. So I think they'd like to have a bunch more hearings. But the Democrats want to get out on the campaign trail. These guys are all coming back after, or the other people on the committee are coming back after the midterms, no matter what happens. So they have a very different agenda. And I think, for their purposes, the January 6th committee has it's served its purpose, but it's now run its course. So they had to figure out a way to wind it up. I think Benny Thompson, the chairman of the committee, agreed to have one more hearing because they had said that they would have a final hearing. But, interestingly, Rich, right before the hearing started, they changed the status of it from a hearing to a business meeting. So that was the signal that nothing of particularly great interest was going to happen at the hearing. And all that ended up happening was these 9 windbags gave what Thompson referred to as their opening statements. So in a 2.5-hour hearing, we heard 2 hours of opening statements, which was peppered, as you just said, with all stuff that we had heard before. You're quite right. I thought the clips of live action in connection with these leaders in Congress trying to deal with January 6th as it was happening, particularly Pelosi, was very dramatic. And I don't think it dramatic just for news junkies. I was transfixed watching it. And I think most people would be, because you're seeing, how leaders react in a situation where people actually were fearful that things could unravel in a way that was even worse than what happened. So that was very interesting. But, as I sat there, the lawyer in me couldn't help but say, none of this would be admissible in a trial. Nancy Pelosi's, agitating and furious at Trump may have been justified, but it wasn't admissible evidence that he ordered an insurrection, So it was interesting, but I don't think it advanced the ball much. And Rich, look, I'd say two things about it. One is the subpoena to Trump is just theater. I mean, there are no legislative days between now and Election Day. And then there's the lame duck session. Trump is not going to testify. They're not going to get him on the stand. And subpoenaing, even, I know they think that there's Trump is sui generis, so they can do whatever they want with respect to him. But the fact of the matter is he's a former president of the United States. Subpoenaing him is not the same as subpoenaing Steve Bannon. There are significant, profound constitutional issues that go back to the founding, where the framers did not want Congress to be in control of the executive branch, which has always taken the position that the president has absolute immunity from testifying. And Biden's got to understand that if they can do it to Trump, they can do it to him, and they can do it to every former president. So it's for him to roll over on this is really institutionally, I think, a bad thing.
If I remember correctly, I might be making this up. It's kind of fuzzy, but I believe George Washington testified about something before a committee, and it was such a miserable experience. He's like, nope, never doing that again. And that's how they got the precedent. Yeah,
I think Chad Pergram, when I was on with the Fox guys yesterday, said that the last president to testify at a hearing was Gerald Ford, who testified in 1983 about the Constitution. I mean, it was probably one of these things where he decided it was a good thing to do. And I do remember that Bush and Cheney jointly agreed to sit down with the 9/11 Commission, but that wasn't a congressional hearing. They did it jointly. It wasn't under oath. It was very different. And of course, everybody took the position that Bush didn't have to do it. He agreed to do it. So to subpoena, to do something that's backed with legal compulsion and the possibility of a contempt citation to an American president, even a former one, I think is a bridge too far, especially because what Liz said when she teed up the subpoena is that Trump is the center of everything, and it's their obligation to get testimony from people who are the major participants. Well, that's what she said in the first hearing they had back in July. So if Trump was the center of everything then. And the other thing is they told us they were going to issue a final report. If they've now said that Trump is an essential witness, how can they issue a report if they haven't talked to him? So the whole thing is theater. They didn't think it through. They needed some pizzazz to end it with. And I'll give you one bit of pizzazz that they could have ended it with, but because this committee doesn't allow cross-examination and alternative perspectives, you don't get it. And everybody in America should know this, but nobody in America other than those who listen to our podcast do. But I would point out that about a 5-minute walk from the committee hearing room on Capitol Hill is the Prettyman Federal District Courthouse, where they are currently having a seditious conspiracy trial of the Oath Keepers. And if you watch the January 6th committee hearings, what you are told is Trump is the center of everything, who ordered his supporters to carry out an insurrection. If you walk down to the courthouse where rules of evidence apply and people are represented by counsel and the government's evidence actually gets scrutinized rather than just put out as propaganda, The Justice Department's position is that Trump did not order an insurrection. Trump is not even an unindicted co-conspirator. They have fought every effort by the defense to try to shift blame from themselves to Trump. And the Justice Department's theory of the case is that the Oath Keepers were planning to attack the United States anyway, and they simply used Trump as a pretext for what they were going to do. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they've taken the position that Trump is not a member of the conspiracy. He's not connected. They were hoping Trump was going to invoke the Insurrection Act so that they could be a militia, but he didn't do it. So everything you hear from the Justice Department, just a 5-minute walk from the Capitol, is that, you know, they're not saying Trump has no relevance to January 6th, but he's like a passing cloud rather than the same in a storm.
So did we ever, was there ever any follow-up? I remember there was talk about people were going to testify, but then I suppose they followed up short. But what happened with the Cassidy Hutchinson limo testimony about Trump lunging towards the wheel and having a physical altercation with a top Secret Service guy?
What happened is, Rich, it disappeared into the black hole. What we then learned was that the Secret Service had, on a routine operation, cleared all of their email. It turned out just happened to be for the relevant period between January 1st and around January 15th. Just, you know, because every now and then you have to clean the system out and, go back.
I would not be familiar with this. I have like 100,000 emails in my
right. Well, Rich, you're not the Secret Service. And then I think we recently learned was Tony Ornato, who was the one who was in the middle of that. He's retiring. I guess he evidently wants to spend more time with his family. So he's not going to be testifying. I didn't know there was a family exception to testimony, but there you have it. And, you know, what the committee said yesterday is they have gotten more cooperation in recent days or recent weeks from the Secret Service. But, you know, they don't have the emails. So there's not much they can really do about that. So the answer to your question is nothing happened about that. And, you know, we were told that we were going to get more information, but like we get told a lot of things that don't happen.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And thank you, Andy McCarthy.
Thanks, Rich.